Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. A coup. I think this is something that we should not discount. Zimbabwe has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. There cannot be any debate about that. Some people have been arguing that we don't want another disputed election. This is already a disputed election. When you have failed to produce a verified voters' roll, when violence has become so rampant, it's unreal. To keep talking of we don't want a disputed election is nonsensical, to say the very least. Yesterday, we were talking about the first individual who was killed by Zanu PF. The video is horrific because at least the video I saw, which I don't know whether that would be the one that resulted in the death, but I saw one where an MDC lorry was carrying MDC activists, and then a mob started throwing stones at the activists. This individual was killed because somebody hit him with a stone on the head and they bled to death. That is the level of violence we are talking about here now. Yes, this one resulted in the death, but many other violent activities have resulted in the thorough beating. In some cases, Triple C candidates have gone into hiding. And the worrying thing is, of course, if the candidates themselves are being intimidated, what more of the election agents? So we'll be looking at a situation here where some of these agents will not show up on polling day. And even if they show up, if they're so intimidated and cowed down to the point where they cannot say what is going on here, we may just as well forget it. We've already heard of how Zanu PF is already holding its cell meetings, and a register is being kept of those who attend those meetings. Of course, it's meant to be intimidation. So I could go on and list the evidence that we already have on how these elections are clearly not free, fair, and credible. The consequences of failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections is that people lose faith in the democratic process. And this has been happening in Africa ever since the various countries on the continent started having their independence. And we have got to address this problem. Some of the opposition are participating in these elections, maintaining they want to continue with the elections because they believe they're going to win. And in their own naivety, they believe that if they win the elections, then the elections will be considered free, fair, and credible. It doesn't work that way. Elections are judged to be free, fair, and credible because of the process. The process must be seen to be free, fair, and credible. If you don't have a verified voters roll, if voters, it doesn't matter whether they are from your side or the other side, are being intimidated, frog marched to vote for a particular party, and people are being beaten and some even killed, that process is already flawed. It can only be judged as a flawed process. And the idea, which is what Chamisa and some of his supporters have got into their head, is that as long as we win, the elections will then be declared free, fair, and credible. No, it's not. The elections are already condemned, and there's already enough evidence to condemn them. So we are stuck in a situation where we have got flawed elections. We have failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And of course, the situation would be even worse if Zanu PF was to win. This brings us back to the problem I was talking about. Issue of people feel they are not being properly represented and are unhappy about that. And this is what has resulted in coups in Africa. This was on BBC. Military coups in Africa over the decades. The decade 1950 to 1959, when African countries started gaining their independence. The number of successful coups and failed coups. 1960 to 69, the number of coups shot up. And every decade has had coups. And if you look at 2010 to 2019, Zimbabwe is there, counted up among the 10 countries that had a coup. Of course, in Zimbabwe, we are not allowed to call it a coup. We're being forced to call it a military-assisted transition. A mouthful. But the truth is, it really means the same thing. The regime has since passed a law that basically says that anyone who calls the 2017 election coup a coup will be committing a crime according to this patriotic bill. That is not going to change the reality, if you ask me. If these elections and the evidence are Zanu PF is rigging them and is going to win them, a lot of people will be disillusioned and will be unhappy about the process and will be back where we started again, where people feel totally helpless. And this is what encourages coup. Nigeria at the present moment has just had a coup. And the coup leaders, ECOWAS, the regional grouping, has threatened military action. And they've got until tomorrow to reinstate the elected government. We would like to call it democratically elected, but if it was Zimbabwe, with the result of these elections, would it be a democratically elected? The answer is, of course not, because the process is flawed. We can't keep on just because people go and vote. If the process itself is not free, fair, and credible, those are not democratic elections. So we are making ourselves vulnerable to yet another coup, or as the present regime would want to call it, another military assisted transition. It doesn't have to be a military one. It could be, this time, is street protests, like what happened in the Arab Spring, forcing the sitting government to collapse. But as we know, some of those countries that have had those Arab Springs have never settled down. We need to implement democratic reforms so that we have free, fair, and credible elections. That is the foundation for political stability and good governance. The idea that, which is what Chamisa and company maintain, of participating in these elections because they believe they can win rigged elections, is pathetic. It's the most idiotic argument we could possibly entertain. And it is shocking that even the intellectuals out there have said nothing about it, if anything at all. And in this case here, their silence can only be mean they endorse that position. And so the country is stuck with this idiotic idea of trying to win rigged elections. We have granted, per se, Zanu PF the right to rig elections. And we have got to fight hard to win rigged, flawed, illegal elections. We are fighting this election. We are going into this election in 3 weeks' time. In fact, less than 3 weeks' time now, without a verified voters' roll. We are going into those elections when there's been rampant violence in the country. And another way that Zanu PF has been rigging these elections is government spending billions of dollars buying votes. It's an outrage that the country's economy has completely collapsed. Basic services like education and healthcare, particularly in the rural areas, have all but collapsed. And yet the regime has got money to bribe judges. All the country's judges on the 6th of June received US $400,000 each. The regime knew these judges are going to play a very crucial role in the electoral process that is taking place right now. So the judges, the magistrates, and all the senior judiciary officials were each given a very attractive incentive, a bribe. This has not been limited to the judiciary only. This has gone on to security sector. All those who are in any way heavily involved with these elections have also received a bribe. The chiefs have received their traditional bribe of a new twin cab truck. Headmen, the same thing. And yet, district hospitals have no ambulances. Where is the government getting, where is Mnangagwa getting all this money from? From the gold mafia and other looting activities. So we are spending billions of dollars to help Mnangagwa win the election at the expense of basic services like education and healthcare. It's amazing, absolutely amazing, unbelievable. But that is a recipe for the country that has failed to achieve peaceful democratic change. We have put ourselves into a corner now where the only change that is possible is a violent one. And in this case, the chances are it's either going to be street protests and or military coup. We've just become another failed African state. In fact, not just, we've been that for the last 20 years at least. And we already have had one coup. And if these elections are certain to happen, another rigged election, I think we'll be ripe for another coup or street protest. We have fallen into the trap that many other African countries have fallen into. And by the way, these coups are only counting military coups. They do not include street protests or civil wars, as what is happening in Sudan right now. Other countries, even in our own region, countries like Mozambique, they've had on and off the civil war there in that country. Endless. And the failure to hold free, fair, and credible election is at the root of it. When people do not feel that they are being given a fair chance in the participation of the democratic, of the governance of the country, they will resort to other ways. And one of the most common problems that we have in Africa is, of course, this cycle of yesterday's liberators becoming today's oppressors, and therefore making it necessary for people to fight for their liberty all over again. And once they've achieved that, it will then become today's liberators becoming tomorrow's oppressors. And so the cycle goes on. We really have got to get the issue of the rule of law sorted out. This election is not about anything but about restoring the right of every citizen of Zimbabwe to a meaningful say in the governance of the country. And clearly we have already missed the boat on that one. This process is already flawed. We are just going through the motions now, waiting for voting day. And what I can tell you now is many of CCC supporters we see attending all these rallies will find that on voting day, they will be denied the vote for one reason or another. Probably the most common one is that they will not find their name on the voters' roll. Or that the name is on the national voters' roll. It's just that the polling station they thought it was, they will find it's not there. On the other hand, the Zanu PF supporters will be able to cast their vote, and in some cases, cast multiple votes, because the regime has been having these runs with passing in supporters from one rally to another. And they will no doubt use that experience to pass in supporters from one polling station to another. It's not the first time we've seen opposition, Zanu PF ruling party supporters being passed in to vote in urban centers, for instance. And the regime has created so many polling stations. It's unreal. In 2008, we had 10 polling stations per constituency. And the constituency has got maybe about 30,000 voters. And there were 10 polling stations. So there were about 3,000 voters per polling station. And they were all able to vote in one day. And the voters' roll was a constituency-based voters' roll. So you could vote in any one of those 10 polling stations. But the regime has since changed that. The number of polling stations this year is believed to be over 12,000 in total. That is over 60 polling stations per constituency. Going from 10 to 60. It's amazing. 2008, there were 10. 2023, there are 60. And it's now a polling station-based voters' roll. Party members are being marked to attend these cell meetings, and on voting day, another register will be kept. Of course, they will know who voted for who within hours of each polling station declaring their results. They'll compare the polling station voters' roll, those who voted, and their own Zanu PF cell meeting register, and quickly ascertain who is not on the cell meeting register, who voted, and tie it to the number of opposition votes. And even some of those people who have been attending cell meetings and thought they could double cross and on the day of voting vote for the opposition for the opposition, I think it will be a question of the party just looking at who among those people who are supposedly attended all the cell meetings, but did not vote for Zanu PF on the day. And I think they can quickly suss that out. This is the reality. In 43 years, we have failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. That is the reality. We cannot run away from that reality. To pretend that this process is anything else other than a flawed process is totally meaningless. It is a flawed process. It is. The elections have already been rigged. So why pretend that they are? We somehow it's still a valid process. It's not. I think we need to look ourselves hard in the mirror and say, are we really that incompetent that we can't organize free, fair, and credible elections? That we don't even know what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections? To go through this process, anyone who is going through it, you say to yourself, what's wrong with you? Are you crazy? How can you go through this process that is so flawed? That is already should be by right be condemned even now. We don't have to wait for the votes to be counted. The process is flawed already. Seriously, are we really admitting that we can't hold free, fair, and credible elections? Are we really believing the opposition's idiotic ideas that they can come up with strategies of winning rigged elections, which is by per se accepting that Zanu PF somehow has the right to rig the elections. And we, the citizens, have got to do the best we can to win those rigged elections. The hope for these elections is that SADC will turn around and refuse to rubber stamp this flawed electoral process. Because if SADC denies Zanu PF legitimacy, the country then will be forced to go into another government of national unity, as happened in 2008. This time, I would like to assure Zimbabweans that we can stand up and say, no, we want members of that government of national unity to deliver on the democratic reforms. We can get Zimbabweans competent enough to implement those reforms. Because if we do, we will drain the sewage pond, which is our political system right now, which has failed to produce competent leaders, both in the ruling party and the opposition. It's like fishing in a sewage pond. You can never get quality fish in it. If we drain this sewage pond, fill it up with clean water, implement all the democratic reforms, that will give us the opportunity to have quality leaders to emerge and get us out of this hell. At the present moment, the way we are going, I think Zimbabwe is candidate for another coup. It's laughable, of course, that people like Mnangagwa can claim that they are not going to accept a military coup. A military coup is not for the leader to say, I accept or I reject. That is what a coup is all about. The leader is now brushed aside. The leader is irrelevant. A coup cannot remove me. ED wants Zanu PF. I think that is the most. Maybe he has got good reason to fear the coup. But trust me, when it comes, it doesn't ask the leader, do you want to be removed? You will just be removed. He should know better. Mugabe did not have the chance to say, no, I don't want to be removed. He tried to stand his ground and he was told in no certain terms that he must go. And I think Mnangagwa must know the same thing as well. A coup becomes justified, and many of the people out there will support it. Because at the present moment, how else are we going to get rid of Mnangagwa? This is the argument that the ordinary citizen has got to face. How else are we going to get rid of him? We try to hold the elections, and unfortunately, the opposition is selling out here and participating in an electoral process that they know is flawed out of greed. And that is repeated, this cycle of we hold the elections and they never produce any meaningful change. And this election is no different. This election is already a flawed process. Zanu PF, if they were to lose it, it would be, well, unbelievable. Because they've got all the opportunity to win it. And even if Chamisa was to win it, the kind of government that will emerge out of it will be a very much compromised government. It will not be competent to implement anything of substance. That is a fact. When are we going to end this cycle of meaningless elections dragging us deeper and deeper into this political and economic hell? I think we really need to wake up now. This election should have never taken place without reforms. These elections should be condemned as a waste of time because they are a waste of time. There's 3 weeks to go. And I think in those 3 weeks, people should make sure that their voices are heard. They condemn this process for the flawed and illegal process that it is, and demand that SADC should not rubber stamp this and give Zanu PF legitimacy. The best outcome for Zimbabwe out of this process would be for the country to go into a new GNU so that we can implement the democratic reforms and clean up this flawed process. We can't carry on with this flawed process. It's already condemned. It's absolutely meaningless to keep on carrying on. With that, thank you very much for listening, and good night.